Okay, so you want to own a ranch, thousands of acres of open land, cowboys on horseback, your own cattle grazing under a big sky, a private lake somewhere on the back 40. You wake up at sunrise, drink your coffee on the porch, and watch your investment grow. That's the picture. That's what movies sell you. That's what the real estate listing photos are designed to make you feel. Here's what the listing doesn't show you. The well pump that burned out last Tuesday, the $40,000 fence line that washed out in the spring flood, the hay bill that arrived the same week the cattle market dropped, and the fact that you haven't made a single dollar of profit in 3 years because every cent you earned went back into the land before you could touch it. Ranching is one of the most misunderstood business models in America. On the outside, it looks like freedom. On the inside, it looks like a business where your revenue arrives once or twice a year, your expenses arrive every single day, and the most powerful variable in your financial equation, the weather, answers to nobody. Some ranches genuinely make money. Some ranches quietly bleed their owners dry while appreciating in value on paper. And some ranches destroy people who never saw it coming. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly which kind you're likely to buy and why. Before we talk about money, we need to talk about what a ranch actually is. Because ranch is one of those words that gets used to describe about a dozen completely different businesses that happen to sit on land. A cattle ranch raises beef animals. A sheep ranch raises wool and meat. A horse ranch breeds and trains horses. A bison ranch is a specialty protein operation that most consumers never see. A hunting ranch monetizes wildlife rather than livestock. A guest ranch sells experiences, trail rides, campfires, the feeling of cowboy life for a long weekend. And a luxury recreational ranch, which is a category unto itself, may raise almost nothing at all. Its primary product is a tax advantage and a private address. These are not the same business. They share a zip code and some fencing, but they have almost nothing in common financially. A Texas Hill Country guest ranch and a Montana cattle operation might both be called ranches, but one is essentially a boutique hotel with horses, and the other is a commodity protein farm that has to fight global beef markets every single day. The reason this matters is that the economics depend entirely on which of these you're actually running. This script is going to focus primarily on the cattle ranch, the most common version, the one most people picture, and the one with the most moving parts, while explaining where the other models fit in the land. The number that sounds big but gets bigger. The largest single cost of owning a ranch is not the cattle. It is not the equipment. It is the land itself, and depending on where in the United States you buy, that number can range from remarkably cheap to almost incomprehensibly expensive. According to the United States Department of Agriculture's most recent land values summary, the national average for pasture land in America is $1,920 per acre as of 2025. That sounds manageable, but that average is hiding a spread so wide it is almost meaningless. In Wyoming, the average farm and ranch real estate is around $1,000 per acre. In far west Texas, you can find land for as little as $616 per acre. These are the cheap options. There is a reason they are cheap. Now go to Austin and the surrounding hill country in Texas. That same land runs $7,000 to $30,000 per acre, and some parcels go higher. Colorado's Front Range corridor, meaning the land near Denver, Boulder, and the resort towns, runs $15,000 to $50,000 per acre. In those markets, the agricultural value of the land and the real estate value of the land have completely decoupled. You are not paying for what the grass produces. You are paying for the view and the proximity to wealthy buyers. Let's do the math on what this actually means. Say you want a serious cattle operation, something big enough to generate real income. In the ranching world, a meaningful operation starts somewhere around 200 to 500 cows. To run 500 cows in Wyoming, where you might need 20 to 30 acres per cow due to the arid conditions and sparse vegetation, you need somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 acres. At $1,000 per acre, that is $10 to $15 million just for the land, before a single cow, before a single fence post. Now here is the trap that gets a lot of new buyers. They see the cheap land and think, bargain. Wyoming at $1,000 an acre versus Texas Hill Country at $15,000 an acre. Surely Wyoming is the smart play. But here is what the cheap land means in practice. It means the grass is sparse. Each cow needs far more of it. It means the winters are brutal, which means you will spend 5 to 7 months feeding expensive hay because there is no grass for grazing. It means your nearest feed supplier might be an hour and a half away. And it means the distance to a cattle auction or a processing facility adds significant transportation costs every time you move an animal. The cheap land is cheap for a reason. It forces you to spend more on everything else. In Texas, where hill country land runs expensive, a cow might only need 2 to 8 acres because the vegetation is denser and the growing season is longer. You spend less time feeding hay in winter. You're closer to markets. The land costs more, but it costs you less to operate per animal site. Index equals 5:1. The average cost per acre across Texas is now up to $5,158, with regions varying wildly. The Panhandle running around $1,844 per acre, while Austin area ranches can reach several thousand above that. Site fee is the first lesson of ranch economics. The price of the land and the profitability of the land are two completely different numbers. You found the land. You made the offer. You closed the deal. You think you own a ranch. What you actually own is a very expensive piece of dirt with a for sale sign removed from it. Before that land produces a single dollar, you need to build the infrastructure that makes it operational. And this is the part that blindsides most new owners. Because the infrastructure costs are not optional, they are not small, and they do not show up in the listing price. First, fencing. A standard 5-strand barbed wire fence runs $8,000 to $13,000 per mile to install. That sounds manageable until you realize that a 15,000-acre ranch has a perimeter of somewhere around 60 to 80 miles. Plus, you need interior cross fences to divide the property into separate pastures for rotational grazing. You can easily spend $300,000 to $600,000 on fencing alone before a single cow sets foot on the property. In rocky or heavily wooded terrain, those numbers go up significantly. Second, water. In most of the American West, surface water is scarce and regulated. You need water wells, and a deep agricultural well costs $8,000 to $25,000 per unit to drill and equip with a pump. That pump, by the way, runs on electricity, which means you need power lines or solar panels reaching across miles of remote pasture. Then you need miles of underground pipe to move water from the well to the troughs where the cattle actually drink. A single well serves only a certain number of acres, so large ranches need multiple wells. Budget $50,000 to $100,000 for water infrastructure before you see the full picture. Third, working facilities. You cannot vaccinate, sort, or load cattle onto a truck without corrals. A proper set of heavy steel working corrals, the kind that can safely handle a 1,200-pound animal that does not want to be handled, cost $15,000 to $50,000. You also need a hydraulic squeeze chute, which is the device that holds an animal still while a veterinarian examines it. Add another $10,000 to $15,000. Fourth, storage. Cattle eat hay in the winter. A round bale of hay that weighs around 900 pounds and lasts a single cow about 3 days costs $50 to $120 per bale, depending on the year and the region. If you're feeding 500 cows through 5 months of winter, you need roughly 25,000 bales. You need somewhere to store them that keeps them dry, because wet hay develops mold, and moldy hay is worthless. A hay barn large enough to matter costs $40,000 to $150,000. Add workers' housing, because nobody is going to drive 2 hours each way to work on your ranch. Add equipment sheds to keep your machinery from rusting. Add gravel roads so your feed trucks don't sink into the mud in March. When you add it all up, fencing, water systems, corrals, storage, housing, roads. A new owner on a raw property can spend $500,000 to over $1 million on infrastructure before the ranch is even operational. This is money that goes into the property and does not generate any immediate return. It is the cost of simply being ready to begin the livestock. The asset that eats, now you buy the cattle. Finally, something you can actually sell, a commercial cow, a bred female, meaning she is already pregnant and will produce a calf, costs somewhere between $2,000 and $3,500 in a normal market. Acre index equals 24-1, but in 2025, calf prices have hit record highs, with 500 to 600 pound steer calves reaching $480 per hundredweight at their peak in October 2025, compared to $335 per hundredweight at the start of the year. Replacement females, The ones you'd buy to rebuild or start a herd are priced accordingly. A herd of 500 commercial cows costs roughly $1 million to $1.5 million to assemble at current prices. These are not prize-winning animals. These are working commercial cattle. Now add bulls. You need roughly one bull per every 25 to 30 cows to maintain adequate breeding coverage. For 500 cows, that is 17 to 20 bulls. A basic commercial bull costs $3,500 to $5,000. A quality bull with documented genetics and performance records, the kind that will produce calves that gain weight faster and grade higher at the packing plant, can easily run $10,000 to $50,000 at auction. Good genetics matter more than people outside the industry realize. A bull that produces calves that gain weight 15% faster than average, or calves that grade at the choice or prime level rather than select at the packing plant, directly increases your revenue per animal. The difference between a choice grading steer and a select grading steer at the packing plant can be $50 to $100 per animal. Multiplied across hundreds of calves per year, the genetics of your bullpen determine a significant portion of your annual income. But here is the thing about bulls. They get injured. They get sick. A good bull can break a leg in a creek crossing and be gone before Monday morning. You cannot breed your entire herd without backup coverage. And the bull you paid $35,000 for does not come with a warranty, your livestock investment. All in for a 500 cow operation in the current market, somewhere between $1.2 and $2 million. And unlike a warehouse, your inventory breathes, eats, gets sick, dies, escapes, and occasionally refuses to cooperate. The equipment. The fleet that never stops breaking. A ranch without machinery is a ranch that cannot function. And the machinery bill is another one of those costs that catches new owners off guard, because the list of necessary equipment is longer than it looks. At minimum, you need tractors, at least two, because when one breaks down during calving season or during the winter feeding rush, you cannot wait 3 weeks for a repair. Utility tractors capable of running hay feeding equipment and front-end loaders run $60,000 to $120,000 a piece new. Many ranchers buy used, which cuts the price but adds maintenance risk. You need a hay baler if you're growing your own hay. A quality round baler runs $25,000 to $40,000. You need trucks, specifically heavy-duty pickup trucks capable of pulling loaded livestock trailers at $55,000 to $85,000 each in today's market. You need a gooseneck livestock trailer to move cattle to auction at $20,000 to $45,000. You need a hay wagon, a utility task vehicle for checking fences across rough terrain, a fuel storage tank and pump so you're not driving to town every other day for diesel. One common mistake new ranch owners make is buying everything new. The monthly debt service on $200,000 of financed equipment at current interest rates can easily run $3,000 to $4,000 per month. That is $36,000 to $48,000 per year in equipment payments before a single animal is sold. On a small or mid-sized operation, that alone can be the difference between breaking even and losing money. The smarter approach, the one experienced ranchers use, is to buy equipment sized to the operation. A person with 200 cows does not need the same tractor as a person with 1,000 cows. The operating costs. The bills that arrive every single day. Here is the structural problem at the heart of ranching, and it is the one thing that separates people who understand this business from people who are surprised by it. Revenue arrives seasonally. Expenses arrive daily. When you sell cattle, you get paid in the fall, once or maybe twice a year. When the hay bill arrives, when the vet calls about a sick animal, when the fuel tank needs filling, when the fence gets washed out, those bills don't wait for October. Site index equals 14.1. According to the United States Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, the estimated annual cow-calf operating costs for the Northern Great Plains in 2024 were $950 per cow, with feed alone accounting for $610 of that. Fixed costs, equipment, labor, overhead added another $900 per cow on top. Let that land for a moment. On a 500 cow operation in the Northern Plains, you're spending roughly $925,000 per year just in operating and fixed costs before you count land costs or debt service. That is before you've sold a single calf. Site index equals 16-1. The total operating costs for cow-calf production in 2025 are forecast at $1,059 per head, according to the Livestock Marketing Information Center. .NAR, feed is the largest single cost. When grass is growing, cattle graze for free, but grass does not grow year-round in most of the country. From November through April in a typical northern state, you are buying or hauling hay every single day. A large round bale costs $50 to $120 depending on the year and the quality. One cow in a cold winter needs roughly one bale every 3 to 4 days. 500 cows, 150 days of winter feeding, you are looking at somewhere between $125,000 and $300,000 just in hay. And that is a normal winter. Add a late spring storm, add a dry summer that stunted the hay crop. Add the fact that diesel to run the tractor cost 30% more than it did 3 years ago, and the feed line on your budget gets very uncomfortable very fast. Veterinary costs are the second surprise. Healthy cattle get sick. Calves are born in February blizzards and need intervention to survive. Cows develop foot problems that require expensive antibiotic treatments. A herd of 500 cows needs regular pregnancy testing, systematic vaccinations, deworming treatments, and emergency care. And all of that adds up to $35 to $60 per head per year just for basic herd health. That is $17,000 to $30,000 annually. In a good year, labor is third. You cannot run a real cattle operation alone. A working ranch needs a manager, at least 1 or 2 experienced hands, who can actually ride horses and work cattle, and a mechanic capable of keeping the equipment running. Site index equals 18-1. The Kansas Farm Management Association estimates the total annual cost of maintaining a cow at approximately $1,551 based on 2024 data. A significant portion of that is labor, and finding experienced, reliable ranch help has become one of the hardest problems in agriculture. The physical demands of the work, the remote locations, and the long hours have made it increasingly difficult to attract younger workers. Many ranches now rely on the federal H-2A, Temporary Agricultural Worker Visa program, to bring in international seasonal labor, which adds administrative costs and requires providing housing for those workers on the property. Add property taxes, liability insurance, electricity for the well pumps and facilities, fuel for the vehicle fleet, and routine repairs. And the operating cost of a serious ranch is not a part-time expense. It is a business with a payroll and a utility bill and a maintenance schedule, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the revenue model. The part that has to work. The core of a cattle ranch's revenue is simple. You raise a calf, you sell the calf. A cow is pregnant for 9 months, delivers a calf, nurses it for 6 to 8 months, and then you wean the calf and sell it. The calf typically weighs 500 to 600 pounds at weaning. You sell it by the pound. Site index equals 26-1 in 2025. 500 to 600 pound steer calves in North Dakota started the year at an average of $335 per hundredweight and continued increasing at record levels, reaching above $480 per hundredweight in October before retreating seasonally to end the year averaging $449 per hundredweight. That means a 550-pound steer calf at weaning in a strong market might sell for around $2,400 to $2,600 per head. Let's use $2,400 as a working number. 500 cows. With a good conception and calving rate, call it 90%, which is strong. You wean 450 calves. Half of those are steers, half are heifers. The steers sell at full market price. The heifers sell at a slight discount because they weigh a little less, and the market prices them differently. Let's say an average net sale price across the whole calf crop of around $2,200 per head. 450 calves times $2,200 equals $990,000 in calf revenue. Call it roughly $1 million in gross revenue. Against that $1 million, your total costs, operating costs, feed, veterinary, labor, fuel, taxes, insurance, equipment depreciation, are somewhere between $900,000 and $1.1 million on a well-run operation of this size. Do the math. In a good year, in a strong market like 2025, you might net somewhere between $0 and $100,000 on a 500 cow operation, requiring an initial investment of $7 to $12 million in land, infrastructure, and livestock. That is a return on investment of somewhere between 0 and about 1.4%. A savings account at a credit union pays more. This is the dirty secret of commodity cattle ranching that nobody in the romance of the industry wants to say out loud. The cash-on-cash returns from simply selling calves are, in most years, remarkably thin, sometimes negative. Now, here is where it gets dangerous. Those $990,000 in revenue assumed a 90% calf crop, a $500 per hundredweight market, and a normal winter. None of those things are guaranteed. Sucksite index equals 33 at 1. As of 2025, the total United States beef herd, including calves, stood at 94.2 million head, the lowest level recorded since the early 1950s. That happened because of a combination of prolonged drought, high input costs, and ranchers selling cattle they couldn't afford to feed rather than expanding herds they couldn't afford to grow. The drought that started in the Southern Plains in 2011 and returned across multiple regions through the early 2020s forced tens of thousands of ranchers to make the same painful decision: sell now or watch the cattle die on dried-up pastures. Site index equals 38-1. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, farm earnings tend to decline with drought, and farms in areas facing severe droughts suffer even worse financial losses. When a drought hits, what happens to the ranch economics is this. The grass stops growing in June instead of September. You start buying hay 2 months early. The hay you need is now in short supply because everyone else needs it too, so the price goes up, sometimes double or triple what it was the year before. You can either buy it at those prices and watch your operating costs spike, or you can sell cattle to reduce the herd size so there are fewer mouths to feed. If you sell, you get a decent price per head. Markets often rise briefly when lots of cattle hit the auction, but you've destroyed your production capacity. You sold cows. Those were your income-generating assets. The following year, you have fewer calves to sell. And to rebuild the herd after a drought, you have to buy replacement cattle at prices that are now high because everyone is trying to rebuild at the same time. Site index equals 36-1. When drought conditions diminish forage production and availability, beef cattle producers often must buy supplemental feed and forage or reduce their herd size. The national beef cattle herd shrank about 1 to 2% per year during drought between 2011 and 2015. The drought cycle is not an edge case. It is a recurring feature of the ranching landscape in most of the American West. What the cattle market gives you in a good year, a drought takes back over the following 3 years. And then there is the cattle market itself. Cattle prices move in cycles, historically 8 to 12 years from peak to trough and back again. In 2015, feeder steer prices dropped $85 per hundredweight from their peak in a single marketing season. Ranchers who bought replacement cattle at peak prices found themselves holding animals worth significantly less than what they paid. The cycle that drove prices up, tight supply, eventually reverses as ranchers rebuild herds, supply increases, and prices retreat. Site index equals 25-1. The feeder cattle index has had a $55 per hundredweight price range just in the first 6 months of 2025. That is a $55 swing in 6 months on cattle you are trying to budget for. If you're selling a 500-pound steer, a $55 move per hundredweight means a $275 swing in the value of that single animal. Across 450 calves, that is $123,000 of revenue that can appear or disappear based on market timing. This is the volatility trap. The costs are relatively fixed. The revenue is anything but. The people who should have won and didn't. If you want to understand what ranch economics really looks like from the inside, you don't need a spreadsheet. You need to look at what happened to serious, experienced ranchers over the last decade. Take a look at what the Texas drought of the early 2020s did to ranchers who had been in the business for generations. These were not first-time buyers. These were families who had ranched the same land for 50 or 75 years. They knew every waterhole, every low spot where the grass came in thick, every corner of the property, and the drought didn't care. Pastures that had reliably fed cattle for decades turned to cracked clay. Stock tanks dried up. Ranchers who refused to sell, who held on, hoping for rain, eventually sold anyway. But at the bottom of the market, after burning through their cash reserves buying hay at prices they never expected to see. Site index equals 35.1. As Texas A&M Extension beef cattle specialist Jason Clear put it, everything in ranching costs more. Input costs for feed, labor, and energy exceeded the increases seen after the 2011 drought, and record cattle prices failed to fully offset reduced profitability. Site, the structural problem is this. The costs of ranching are incurred in real time in today's dollars. Feed costs more, fuel costs more, labor costs more, equipment costs more. But the cattle market, the price your calves bring, is determined by supply and demand dynamics that play out over years, not months. Site index equals 35.1. Oklahoma State University agribusiness professor David Anderson noted that inflation-adjusted returns for ranchers are actually sharper than they appear in nominal terms. 500-pound calves today command similar nominal prices to those a decade ago, but adjusted for inflation, the real returns are lower. Not in sight, the people who survive long-term in ranching are not the ones who got lucky with a good year. They are the ones who managed costs tightly enough to survive the bad years without depleting the asset, and who built revenue from more than one place. The ranchers who make real money are not necessarily the ones running the biggest cattle operations. They are the ones who looked at their land and asked, what else does this produce that someone will pay for? Hunting leases are one of the most reliable secondary revenue streams in American ranching, and they are dramatically underutilized by operators who think of themselves as cattle ranchers only. In Texas, a rancher can lease hunting rights to white-tailed deer, quail, turkey, or exotic game species to hunting clubs or corporate groups. Annual per-acre hunting lease rates in strong deer country can run anywhere from $5 to $25 per acre. On a 15,000-acre ranch, that is $75,000 to $375,000 per year for access rights. And the cattle are still there, and the grass is still there, and you have not sold anything. Hay production and hay sales are another often overlooked source. If your property has irrigated meadows or high-quality native pasture, you can cut and bale surplus hay in good years and sell it to neighboring ranchers who are short. In drought years, that hay becomes valuable enough that some ranchers make more money from their hay than from their cattle. Conservation easements are the most powerful and most misunderstood financial tool available to landowners. Here is how it works. You agree with a nonprofit land trust to permanently restrict certain uses of your property. You agree that it cannot be subdivided, that commercial development cannot happen, that the natural character of the land must be preserved. In exchange, you claim a charitable deduction on your federal income taxes equal to the difference between what the land was worth before the restriction and what it's worth afterward, because restricted land is worth less on the open market than unrestricted land. For landowners who qualify as qualified farmers or ranchers, meaning more than half of their gross income comes from ranching, the charitable deduction can be claimed at 100% of adjusted gross income, with a 15-year carry forward. Depending on the value of the property and the size of the restriction, this can eliminate federal income tax liability for the landowner for a decade and a half. This is a legal tax strategy. It is not a loophole or a workaround. It is a provision in the federal tax code specifically designed to incentivize private landowners to preserve agricultural land rather than sell it to developers. Guest ranch and agritourism revenue is a third category that has exploded in the past decade. Americans want to experience ranch life without actually ranching. They will pay substantial money for a long weekend that includes trail rides, working cattle, eating meals around an outdoor fire, and sleeping in a comfortable cabin in the middle of nowhere. Nightly rates at premium guest ranches run $300 to $800 per person per night, all inclusive. On a property with 10 cabins at 80% occupancy for 6 months of the year, that math gets interesting very quickly. The point is not that any single one of these alternatives transforms a struggling cattle operation into a thriving business. The point is that a ranch with multiple revenue streams, cattle, hay, hunting leases, conservation income, guest experiences, has a much smoother cash flow and a much higher tolerance for the bad years that the cattle business inevitably delivers. Here is something that puzzles people who look at the operating economics we just described. If ranching is so financially marginal, why do some of the wealthiest people in America keep buying ranches at prices that no operating cattle business could ever justify? Ted Turner owns roughly 2 million acres across multiple states, making him the largest private landowner in the United States. John Malone, the cable television billionaire, owns over 2 million acres. Jeff Bezos has acquired significant ranch land in Texas. Bill Gates, through his investment vehicles, has become one of the largest private farmland owners in the country. Stan Kroenke owns the massive Broken Arrow Ranch in Montana, covering over 124,000 acres. These people are not buying ranches because they expect to get rich selling calves. They are buying ranches for reasons that are almost entirely separate from the agricultural economics of the land: privacy and security. A 100,000-acre ranch is an address that essentially does not exist on a map, a private airstrip, and a perimeter that keeps the outside world outside. For someone worth tens of billions of dollars, that is worth a significant premium. Capital appreciation. Land is finite. Agricultural land in the United States has appreciated consistently over the long run, not dramatically in most years, but reliably. It does not go to zero. It does not suffer a corporate earnings miss. It does not have a bad quarter. Index equals 8-1. Wyoming's farm real estate has increased 33% in value since 2020 alone. In Montana and Colorado, premium ranch properties have outperformed in both direction and pace. The conservation easement mathematics. A billionaire who donates a conservation easement on a $100 million ranch can claim a deduction equal to the decline in the property's value, potentially $50 or $60 million. At the highest marginal federal tax rate, that deduction shelters the equivalent of roughly $20 million in taxes. The ranch itself continues to be owned and used. The tax benefit is immediate and legally sound, and agriculture tax exemptions at the state level. In Texas, maintaining an active agricultural operation on a property, which can mean as few as a certain number of cattle per acre, qualifies the land for an agricultural exemption on property taxes. Property taxes on 10,000 acres at full commercial real estate valuation might run hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. With an agricultural exemption, the same land might be taxed at a fraction of that. For a wealthy buyer, keeping a small cattle operation running purely to maintain, the ag exemption is an entirely rational financial decision. This explains why so many ranches run a handful of cattle on land that would not support a real commercial operation. The cattle are not the business. The tax status is the business. Let's build a real scenario. Not a worst case and not a best case. A realistic first year for someone who buys a 5,000-acre ranch in Central Texas, assembles a herd of 200 cows, and tries to run a legitimate cattle operation. Land, 5,000 acres at $7,000 per acre. That is $35 million for the land. For the purpose of this exercise, let's say the buyer puts down 40% and finances the rest, resulting in annual debt service of roughly $1.4 million per year. But Skrosk, if the property is in reasonable shape but needs fencing upgrades and new water systems. $300,000 upfront. Livestock, 200 bred cows plus 12 bulls. Roughly $500,000 to $600,000 at current market prices. Equipment, 2 tractors, 2 trucks, a livestock trailer, a hay baler, a utility task vehicle. Approximately $250,000 used. Total initial capital deployed, somewhere around $37 to $38 million, including the land. Without the land, the operating investment is roughly $1,100,000 to $1,200,000. First-year operating costs for 200 cows at $1,059 per head, $212,000. First-year calf crop. Assume 170 calves at a 90% conception rate, minus some mortality. At current 2025 market prices for 500-pound calves, let's say $2,200 average. Gross calf revenue is $374,000. Net operating income before land costs, $162,000. That is a real profit on the cattle operation in isolation, possible in a strong market like today's. Against $35 million of land and an annual debt service of $1.4 million, the cattle operation covers about 11 cents of every dollar of the land financing. This is why ranches operate at what the industry calls a return on assets of 1 to 3% in a good year. The asset, the land, is simply too expensive relative to what it can produce agriculturally. But the land itself is likely worth more in year 5 than it was on day 1. If land in Central Texas appreciates at 4% per year, roughly the pace the USDA is currently measuring, That $35 million land purchase generates $1.4 million of appreciation annually, which is almost exactly what the annual debt service costs. What you're doing in essence is using the cattle operation to cover the operating costs, while the land itself builds equity. The cattle pay for the privilege of owning the land. The land builds the wealth. That is the actual economics of ranching for most serious owners. The two scenarios. Honest math, the good year. You have 500 cows in Texas. 90% calving rate delivers 450 calves. Markets stay strong. Steers average $400 per hundredweight, heifers a bit less. Your average net sale price across the calf crop is $2,300. Total calf revenue, $1,035,000. Your operating costs ran $900,000 because hay was cheap after a wet spring and fuel costs didn't spike. Net profit from cattle operations, $135,000. Your 10,000 acres appreciated 4%, adding roughly $2.8 million to your net worth on paper. Great year, the bad year. Late spring blizzard kills 60 calves during a 2-day storm in March. Drought in July means you start buying hay 2 months early at prices 30% above budget. Your hay cost runs $200,000 above forecast. Cattle market softens in the fall. Buyers are cautious, there's more supply, and your steers bring $320 per hundredweight instead of $400. Your total calf revenue is $720,000. Operating costs hit $1.1 million with the extra feed costs. Net loss from cattle operations, $380,000. Your land value was flat this year, no appreciation. Rough year, the gap between those two scenarios is over $500,000. That is the volatility of this business. And that gap is driven almost entirely by weather and market timing, two things you cannot control. The difference between ranchers who build wealth and ranchers who go broke is not intelligence. It is not even hard work, because everyone in this industry works hard. It is cash reserves, diversified revenue, and the ability to survive the bad year without selling the land, because the land is the whole game. The cattle are the cover charge. The land is what makes you wealthy, slowly over decades, through a combination of appreciation and tax efficiency that no other asset class quite replicates, which means the answer to whether a ranch can make you rich is, yes, it can, but probably not in the way you imagined, not through the cattle, and not on the timeline you had in mind when you first pictured yourself standing on that porch watching the sun come up over your own horizon. The romance of the ranch is real. The economics of the ranch are complicated. The people who thrive here are the ones who hold both of those truths at the same time and plan accordingly.